Hi folks, my name is Jeremy Stretch. I'm the founder and lead maintainer of the NetBox open source project, and in this video I'll be walking you through the installation of NetBox version 3.3. To start out, we're going to go to docs.netbox.dev. That's the official documentation site for the project. And on the left hand side, we're going to go to installation and upgrade, and then the installing NetBox heading in the menu. Very quickly, this details the requirements for installing NetBox. Most notably, we're going to need Python 3.8, PostgreSQL 10 or later, and Redis 4.0 or later. Python 3.8, 3.9, and 3.10 are supported by NetBox version 3.3, so long as you have one of those installed, you should be good to go. The documentation also notes that it's been tested to work on Ubuntu 20 and CentOS 8.3. It should work no problem on later releases. In fact, in this release, I'm going to be using Ubuntu 22. It should work fine on other Linux installations as well. However, these are what are officially supported and documented in the installation notes. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing we'll need to do is install PostgreSQL, so that's going to serve as our database. Again, as noted, we need PostgreSQL 10 or later. So let's go ahead and get started on our shell here. So this is just a blank installation of, default installation of Ubuntu 22. You see that right there, we are running Ubuntu 22.04. So we'll proceed with the installation of PostgreSQL. I've already run apt update, so we can skip that. That's just bringing all the package libraries up to date. Did that because this is a new installation. So we're going to start by running apt install PostgreSQL, and again, doing that as the root user. So nothing unusual here. This is just installing the PostgreSQL database server for Ubuntu. Let's go ahead and check our next steps. So once PostgreSQL has been installed, we want to make sure that we start the PostgreSQL service as well as enable it to start at boot time. So we'll go ahead and copy those commands. And then wait for the installation to wrap up here. Okay, now we're going to paste in those commands from the documentation. Okay, so we've enabled those servers, and finally we're just going to double check the installed version by running the PSQL command line utility with the capital V flag. And here we see we've actually installed Postgres 14.5, so we're much further ahead. 10 again is just the minimum required version. Okay, now that we have our database service up and running, we need to go ahead and create a database. The way we do that is we're going to enter the PostgreSQL command line by executing the command line PSQL executable as the Postgres user. All right, so this drops us into the PostgreSQL database shell. And then we need to create a database. So what we're going to do is first create the database, and then we're going to create a user or a role named NetBox and give that a password. And then finally, we're going to grant privileges for that user to basically do all privileges for that specific database that we've created. So I'm going to copy this. Obviously, in practice, you would choose your own password. I'm just going to use this because it's just for demonstration purposes. So I'm just going to paste those three commands in there. So again, created the database, created the role with the password, and then assigned all privileges to that database. And again, in production, you would change, use your own password, obviously. So now we can go ahead and exit that shell. We can hit \Q or Control-D to get out of that shell. And then once we're back on the Linux terminal, we want to verify that we can connect and authenticate as the user we just created to that database. So to do that, we're going to run PSQL, pass it the username and a password, and connect to localhost on the database in NetBox. So we'll paste that. It's going to prompt us for a password. So I'll go back up here and grab that password that we have defined. And there we go. We've successfully authenticated. We can tell that because we can see the PostgreSQL shell connected. So at this point, we've installed and verified our PostgreSQL database. So let's proceed with the next step, which is the installation of Redis. So Redis is kind of an in-memory key value store. It's used for background task queuing and some caching within NetBox. Very simple to install. For most use cases, the default configuration will suffice. So let's go ahead with that. First thing is to install the Redis server package. And just as we did with PostgreSQL, that's just installing the Redis service on the server. And by the way, you can skip this step if you're using an external Redis server, just as you could skip the PostgreSQL installation as well if you're using an external database that's provided elsewhere. But for the sake of completeness, we're going to cover both of those in this video. All right, now let's double check the version that was installed. As mentioned, we need version 4.0 or later. We're running 6.0, so no concerns there. And like I said, at this stage, you can opt to reconfigure Redis if you want to set certain parameters. For our purposes, we're not really concerned about that. So we're just going to go ahead and use the Redis CLI ping command. That's just going to verify that we have access to the server that's up and running. You send a ping, you get a pong back. That means you're good to go. All right. With those two out of the way, again, we've installed PostgreSQL for our database. We've installed Redis for our in-memory key value store. And now we're good to proceed with the installation of Redis. First, we'll start off by installing our system packages. So those are all listed here under the Ubuntu tab. There's a separate one for CentOS, as you'd expect. So I'll just copy that command and paste that into the terminal. And then I'll just install all the necessary system dependencies that NetBox needs to operate. Once that's done, we'll also verify our installed version of Python. It needs to be at least 3.8. 3.8, I think, is actually the lowest supported version of Python currently, just in general. That'll probably go EOL in a couple years. 3.8, 3.9, or 3.10, you're good to go. 3.11 alpha even currently will probably work just fine. But 3.8, 3.9, and 3.10 are what we officially support. Take just a couple more seconds and that should wrap up. Okay, we'll go ahead and restart the recommended services. It's also worth noting this was a default installation of Ubuntu 22, so quite a bit was probably upgraded as I'm going through this. Now we'll just make sure that we have the correct version of Python installed. Oops. Seems like we didn't get Python installed. Oh, right. It is Python 3 version. There we go. So Ubuntu 22 defaults to Python version 3.10. So that is perfectly good. All right. Next, we need to download NetBox. So we've got two options here. One is to download. NetBox as a package, as a tarball from GitHub. So if you go to the releases page here and look at one of the releases, you see the release notes, and then down at the bottom you've got the source code. So those are provided via both tarball, so tar.gz, and zip files. Same code in both, just two different archive formats. That is one option. The other option is to install it from a Git repository. There's pros and cons to both of these. So with option A, downloading the release archive, it's very straightforward. You don't need any additional utilities. You download the archive, expand it, put it in the right directory, and then you're pretty much moving from there. When you go to upgrade, though, you'll need to do the same thing. Put in a new directory and update the symlink here from op.netbox to whatever specific release that you're running. For this video, I'm going to use the second option, which is Git, just because it might be a little less familiar to people who have, especially someone who's not used Git before. So it might help to run through the steps. This is using the tarball is pretty straightforward, but Git, there's some other concepts to be aware of as far as understanding branches and things like that. So I'm going to proceed with cloning the Git repository. So first I'm going to create opt/netbox on the local machine and change into that directory. Okay, so now I'm in cd opt/netbox. I want to make sure that I have Git installed. I believe it's actually installed by default, but we'll go ahead and make sure that that's the case. Yes, Git is already installed. and it's already up to date, so that's good to go. Next, we're going to clone the master branch of the NetBox repo locally. So NetBox typically has 3 branches at a minimum. Those are master, develop, and feature. So master is the current stable release. Develop is contains any work being done for the next patch release or point release. So for example, if the current release is 3.3.2, the develop branch will have all the work accumulated so far leading up to the upcoming 3.3.3 release. There's also a feature branch which will have all work that is being done for the next minor release version, so in this case 3.4. When we do this, we're going to clone the master branch. We're going to give it a depth of 1 because we don't care about pulling down all of the history. We just want to get the current copy. If you're intending to do any development work for NetBox, you would just omit the depth keyword, make sure you pull down that whole history. But for this, for our purposes, we just want to install the current code base. So again, I'm going to execute this in the current directory. Also make sure on the end here, you've got that dot. That is telling Git to unpack it in, or to install the repo in the current path rather than creating a new NetBox folder within the current path. So we'll do that. Let's do a quick list, show everything here. This is what you should see in the root of the repo. You'll notice all these files are also present in on GitHub. So this listing right here should be the same as what you see in your local clone of the repo. Okay, we've gone through and done all that. So now we've got our local copy. Next, we need to create a NetBox system user. So the purpose of this is just to have a dedicated user called NetBox under which the NetBox processes will actually run. That's just to keep things nice and clean, so we're not piggybacking on any other system users. So under Ubuntu, the commands are add user, and then we're going to change ownership of NetBox media. So the first one, what this is going to do is create a new system user with its own group, both called NetBox. So we'll add that. You see that being created both the user and the group. And the second command here is going to change ownership of the opt.netbox/netbox media repository. So that folder actually holds all the uploaded files. So if someone's going through the NetBox UI and uploading images and whatnot, the NetBox user needs permission to write files to the file system in that directory. So we'll go ahead and apply that as well. Okay. Next, we move on to configuration. So there are a ton of configuration parameters for NetBox, and they're all documented here under the configuration heading. However, there's only a handful of things that you actually need to set upon initial installation. And those are listed here. So first, let's copy the example configuration. So we're going to go, I'm just going to copy this. We're going to cd into the NetBox directory. And then we're going to copy the example config to a new configuration.py file. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and edit this file using Nano. Okay, so we've got our 4 required settings listed down here. The first one is allowed hosts. This is actually a list of the host names that are valid for this server. So not to be confused with, it's not like access control. You're not limiting who can connect to NetBox. This is saying what are the valid host names by which this might be reached. Typically, this is going to be, netbox. Whatever your local domain is, and you might put the IP address, IP4 and or IP6 addresses in here as well if you need to be able to access it by IP directly. For this case, because we don't actually have a domain set up for it, I'm just going to dump an asterisk in here. And that's basically going to tell NetBox to ignore the host, just accept hosts for requests for whatever host name. Typically in production, you don't want to do that, but because we don't have a domain set up for this purpose, we're just going to go ahead and put a wildcard in there. Okay. The next one is the database. So you'll notice that we have a few parameters to set under the database configuration. So the first is the database name, which is NetBox. The next is the username, which is also NetBox. So I'll put that in there, and then we have the password. So remember, the password we set 2 steps ago when we installed PostgreSQL, and that was this string right here. So I'm going to use that, dump that in here. You've got some other parameters as well, but these are typically fine to keep the defaults. The host is going to be localhost because we're running PostgreSQL locally. As I mentioned earlier, if you're running an external database service, you want to go ahead and put the host name or IP address and the port number on which that is running in the configuration here. And then that's at the maximum database connection age, 300 seconds, which is going to be suitable for most use cases. The third parameter under here is Redis. We're connecting to localhost on port 6379. These are the defaults. Again, if you're running Redis externally, you'll want to put update the host name and port number to match that. We're not using a password here because it's running locally. We're using the default database. So for our purposes, this is all fine to keep the defaults. You notice there are two subsections within the Redis configuration parameter. So one is for tasks and one is for caching. So we actually use two different databases, one for either purpose. In this case, we're using the same service for both. We're just using database ID 0 for tasks, and database ID 1 is being used for caching. All right, lastly, we have a secret key. So this is used basically to sign HTTP cookies and things of that nature. It's not super important, but it is something that does need to be kept a secret locally to avoid any kind of security compromise. So what we're going to do right now is save our what we've done so far, and I'm going to go up. Actually, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to execute a script that is packaged with NetBox called generate secret key.py, and what that does is just generate a suitable random key for me. You don't have to use this tool. You're more than welcome to use whatever tool you'd like. But the key here is that the key is that it needs to be unique and kept secret. So we'll just paste that random string in there. Also for high availability, where you have multiple NetBox instances running in tandem, the same secret key must be used on every instance. All right, so we'll save that. And we'll go back to where we left off on step 3 in the installation documentation. All right, so we've got our allowed hosts, database, Redis, and secret key are all set now. We'll skip down to optional requirements. These are some things that may optionally be installed with NetBox if you need that functionality. For example, Napalm integration, remote file storage. We're going to skip these for now just because we don't really have any way to demo these. But if you want to, it's as simple as adding the necessary requirements into a new file called local_requirements.txt in your local installation. And the upgrade script will pick up on that and install anything that's listed in there. All right, next up, we've got the upgrade script. So this handles everything from creating a virtual environment for NetBox to run in and installing all the dependencies. It'll update the database, the database schema migrations. It will build the documentation, everything else that needs to happen for NetBox to be run. It's all handled by the upgrade script. So once we are good to go, we can go ahead and run that. I'm going to CD back up to the root directory, although I'm going to reference the script by its absolute path, so it doesn't really matter where we run it from. Okay, we'll just watch the output of this here as it runs. First, you're going to see it verifies that we're running a supported Python version. Then we're creating a new Python virtual environment. So this is basically, it's somewhat analogous to like a Docker container, but for Python, where you've got your own, we're creating our own subdirectory or isolated environment with our own Python dependencies and everything installed for exactly what we need to run NetBox, so as not to conflict with all the whatever's installed for Python system wide. So this is going to be pertinent just to NetBox itself, and it's kept nice and clean because every time we upgrade NetBox, we're tearing down and rebuilding that environment from scratch. Here we can see the complete list of dependencies that are being installed. It might take a couple minutes the first time you do this. Successive upgrades will use cached downloaded copies of all these dependencies, so it goes a little bit faster the next time you run this, because you're not downloading every new package from the archives. Okay, we've got all our packages installed. Now we see that NetBox is applying schema migrations. So remember in step 1 we created a PostgreSQL database. But that was empty. We had no tables or schema defined in there. So these migration files actually handle the creation of the SQL tables and schema that are necessary for NetBox to function. So this is going through and creating all the individual tables, and it's applying all the changes from successive NetBox releases to update that schema and make sure everything is as it should be in there. So that might take a minute or two. And again, this will be a little bit faster when we go to upgrade in the future. So right now we're installing NetBox 3.3.2, which is the latest release at the time of this recording. So we're September 7th. And successive upgrades won't go through all of this again. They'll just apply whatever additional migrations might be necessary. And typically, most point releases, so 3.3.4.5, won't have migrations. Occasionally they will because something had to be tweaked, but typically migrations are introduced in minor releases. So for example, going from 3.3 to 3.4 or from 3.4 to 3.5. Let's go ahead and skip down a little bit. So after we see the upgrade script complete, we will go through and create a super user. And that super user is going to function as the admin user for our installation. Unlike many applications, NetBox does not install an admin user by default. There's no default username or password. You have to go through and create something. It might take just a minute or two more for the migrations to finish up. So when we go to create that super user, we're going to use what's called a management command. So there's a file on the file system called manage.py under the NetBox subdirectory. And that is actually provided by the Django framework on which NetBox is built. And there's a ton of commands that we can run with that. Everything from creating and applying database migrations to running tests, creating the super user account, and a bunch of other functions. So if you ever see a reference to a management command in NetBox, this is what we're referring to. This particular command is create super user. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that so we're ready to go when this is completed. Okay, the migrations have completed. Now it's going through and you're doing a little bit of housekeeping, just checking for any missing cable paths and so forth. Now we're building the documentation. So the documentation site that you see listed here is actually available locally too. And that's what the script is doing right now, is building out all of this from the source markdown files that exist in the repo. It's building this nice HTML interface we see rendered using MakeDocs and a theme called MakeDocs Material that makes it look all nice like this. That's being built so it's accessible locally as well. Okay, we go through and collect all of our static files. So that's all the CSS and JavaScript and whatnot that needs to serve the UI as well. Going through checking for stale content types. This is a new installation, so there shouldn't be anything like that. Checking for expired user sessions. So remember, again, this is a new installation, but the same script is used for upgrading as well. So it's going to go through and do all this cleanup every time we go through and upgrade NetBox to a newer release. Okay, now we're done. You notice it's got a warning here saying no existing virtual environment was detected. That's expected because, again, this is a new installation versus an upgrade. And then it's got some reminders here. Because it's a new installation, we can ignore that. We're gonna cover that in a little bit. All right, so next let's proceed with creating that super user. Whoops, I forgot to start my my virtual environment. So I'm going to cd up. I think that command's in here. Yep, I skipped right over that. So we're going now. I mentioned the upgrade script creates a virtual environment. We need to activate that, which is really just a matter of sourcing this one file within that directory that the Python virtual environment was created in. Really all that's doing is updating some terminal, some environment variables to essentially effect the virtual environment. That's how we turn it on and off. So we're going to run source with that path. Notice that the prompt down here changed. It's now prepended with venv for virtual environment. So that tells me that I'm in where I need to be. And now what I can do is I'm going to go up one directory, or down, I guess, and run that create super user command. It's going to prompt me for a couple things. The first is going to be the username. It'll default to what I'm logged in as, which is root. We don't want to use that. I'm going to use admin. I'm going to skip the email address, and I'm just going to use admin for the password as well. Now I've got a super user created. All right, so we're making good progress. We're almost done with the NetBox installation. The next is to schedule a housekeeping task. So there's a task that's meant to be run every 24 hours on a NetBox installation that handles some miscellaneous cleanup. If you're curious, all that stuff is documented in here. Basically, we just need to create a cron job for that to run. So I'm going to just create a symlink to netbox housekeeping.shell and run that daily. So I'm going to copy that command. There we go. And that should be sufficient. Okay, at this point, NetBox itself should be installed and functional. We've got our database and our Redis set up. We've got NetBox installed. We've got our Python virtual environment, and we should be able to run the the NetBox workers net right now that run the WSGI protocol that will sit behind the HTTP front end that we have yet to install. But we can try that directly by using another management command, just like we had create super user. This one is run server, and we're going to use this to run essentially kind of a lightweight development-only version of an HTTP front end that will serve NetBox. A couple things to note about this. We're running it on quad 0:8000 just so that it binds to any IP address, including the local loopback. Also notice the insecure flag. This is basically us acknowledging that what we're doing is insecure and not intended for production use. All right, so I'm going to run that command. There we go. It'll take it just a couple seconds to start up, and now we see that we're running on any IP address. So this is going to bind to the public IP address that I have created for this server. Let me go ahead and grab that real quick. Okay, so now this is the IP address that I'm currently building this on. Now if I go there directly, it's going to not connect anything because I'm not running on port 80. I'm actually running on port 8000. Forgive me, I'm trying to work around my microphone right now. And now if I go to that directly, there we go. We have a NetBox user interface. Notice I'm not running SSL. This is just the development server, right? So it doesn't support HTTPS, to my knowledge. We at least haven't configured it. Now I'm going to go to login and try to use the admin credentials that we defined when we ran the create super user management command. No, I don't want to save it. And now I'm authenticated. We see all the menu items have populated over here. I can go to my profile. All right, I'm logged in as admin. And you see I created the account just a few minutes ago. So now we know that at this stage that NetBox itself is working and we can proceed with the rest of the installation. If you run into problems at this stage, don't try to go any further because it's not going to work. You need to backtrace, backtrack a little bit, figure out what went wrong, and make sure you get to this stage, get it working, and are able to successfully log in using the development server before you go any further. Okay, to kill that server, we're just going to hit Control-C. You'll notice that it logs all the requests that are that it's serving while it's running. Okay. Next, we're going to install Gunicorn. Gunicorn is the WSGI server that just sits behind the HTTP server and allows these processes to run long term. Rather than what we're doing with the development server, we're going to set this up for production use. Micro WSGI is also a suitable alternative. The documentation just covers Gunicorn for the sake of brevity. We also provide a reference configuration file for Gunicorn. All right, so I'm going to copy that reference configuration file, which is available under opt netbox contrib, and just copy that over to opt netbox. Okay, if we want to see what that looks like. Oops. And this is our just default configuration. There's not a ton of interest in here. It's just kind of a reference config that should be suitable for most use cases. All right, now that we have Gunicorn configured, we want to proceed with systemd just to install a service that it runs on boot and so forth. So what we're going to do is copy, again, from that contrib directory, we're going to copy the service definitions. So we have 2 of them into etc systemd system. So that's actually going to create 2 services. One is called NetBox, and that's to run those WSGI workers. And one is called NetBox-RQ, and that is to run the background queue handling process, where we're actually taking queued events out of Redis and processing them. So these are 2 independent and discrete services. Okay, so I've copied those services over, and then I should just be able to start them. Okay, so we've started the services and then we've enabled them, so that's creating that symlink as we need. And now we'll go ahead and run status on the first one just to make sure that it is up and running. There we go. You should see this. This is the NetBox WSGI service. It is active and running. Here are the individual workers that are listed out, and here's the beginning of the logging. If you don't see this, if you don't see the basically the green light that says active and running, stop, figure out what the problem is, check out the logging output. That should shine some light on what the potential problem may be, and don't proceed until you've got the service up and running. Okay. At this stage, we can move on to the final step for our demo here, which is installing the HTTP front end. So the 2 most popular options here are nginx and Apache. We're just going to go through nginx in this video for the sake of time, but both are perfectly suitable solutions. For HTTPS configuration, obviously you need a TLS or SSL certificate. For our purposes, I'm just going to use a self-signed cert because I don't really feel like paying them $5 or whatever to get the actual cert set up for this. You can also use Let's Encrypt to get a free one. And if you're going to do that, get the certificate first, go through their installation process, install nginx, get the cert, and then proceed with the configuration. Because the way certbot works, it will automatically pull down, or it'll configure nginx to automatically authenticate to get the certificate provisioned from Let's Encrypt. It's just easier to go through that with a default nginx configuration before you've configured it for NetBox. But like I said, for us, we're just going to go ahead and create a self-signed certificate using the OpenSSL library. All right, so that'll create the certificates that we need. And we'll reference, so it's putting our private key here and our public key here, and we'll just need to reference those paths when we go to configure nginx here in a second. All right, so first we'll install nginx. Once nginx is installed, we need to configure it. And again, NetBox ships with a reference configuration in that contrib directory. These are things that are provided for convenience, but you're certainly free to edit them, to modify them to suit your specific needs. All right. So we'll just wait a second for that to finish installing. And once it does, we'll copy that reference configuration over. I don't think we need to restart any of those. Okay, let's copy that configuration file over. Now, if we look at that, we do need to set one thing in here, which I think we know. Yeah, we do want to set the server name for this. So I'm going to edit that. So down here, the server name parameter that you see, it defaults to netbox.example.com. We want to update that with whatever domain we're using. In our case, as I mentioned, I don't have a domain set up for this, so I'm just going to use the IP address, and that should suffice. Again, down here, we've got our SSL certificate. This is where the documentation, by default will create things if you're creating a self-signed certificate. If your paths are different, you're using a certificate, like a legitimate one that was signed by a certificate authority, it might exist elsewhere. You just need to update these paths. SSL certificate is the public certificate. SSL certificate key is going to be that private key. All right, we'll save our changes. All we've done for this video is to update the server name. Okay, once we've got nginx configured, then we're going to delete this default configuration. That's simply the easiest way to ensure a successful configuration for nginx. If you happen to be running other applications and serving that from the same server, obviously you'll need to adjust for whatever your specific implementation is. So we're going to delete that default, and then we're going to create a symlink from the configuration that we just created in the sites available directory. We're just going to link to that from sites enabled so that nginx knows that is in fact a good and active configuration file. Okay, finally, we're going to restart nginx, and this, if everything goes well, should not complain. All right, that looks good. So now we are good. We've restarted the service after applying the new configuration. And now we're going to skip this this section for configuring Apache and go down here to confirming connectivity. So at this point, if we should be able to connect to this IP address on HTTPS. I'll start a new window here. In fact, if we go straight to it, yep, it will. If we try to connect on TCP/80, it will automatically redirect us because of the redirect rule that we have in the nginx configuration file. So it's redirecting us from plain HTTP on port 80 to HTTPS. Because this is a self-signed certificate that we created locally, it's going to give us a security risk. I'm going to say that's okay. And now we see our NetBox UI. So this is actually running in production. We have NetBox version 3.3.2 installed. We see that down here in the bottom right. Which I guess you can't see on the video because of where I am. Sorry about that. It's right here, version 3.3.2. We don't see anything created yet because again, this is a brand new installation of NetBox, so we don't have any objects created yet. But we should be able to go through and do that. We are logged in as the admin user, so again, I can go see my profile, and I can go find. And here's how I'm logged into everything. I can go look at sites. The first few click-throughs that you do might be a little bit slow. That's because they're being spread across the different workers, and every worker is initializing and kind of caching what it needs to for this first few requests. But then once you're in there for a few seconds, it should become quite a bit more responsive. Okay, so I don't have any devices yet, so I need to go and create a site. But at this point, you have NetBox installed. It is all running in production as you'd expect. If you run into any issues, we've got some tips here for troubleshooting around the nginx and Apache config and things like that. There's some other commands you can run to look into it and see what's going on. And if you still run into trouble, come by our forum on GitHub under the NetBox repo. Go to the discussions tab, and you can just start a discussion asking for help, saying, "Hey, I ran into an issue. Here's what I did, and here's what's happening." Let us know, and someone should be able to point you in the right direction. So that is it for installing NetBox. Again, my name's Jeremy Stretch. I hope you found this video informative, and I will see you next time.